Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Combating Violent Domestic Extremism. My name is Alina Kim, and I am a third year at the college studying political science, history, and media arts and design. I am one of the speaker series interns here at the Institute of Politics, a committee member of the Jukebox Ballot, and a staff writer for politics and pop culture at the GATE, the IOP's Independent Student Political Review. With the polarized 2020 political campaign and the outbreak of the coronavirus, our communities witnessed violent extremist ideologies entering the mainstream, from the Proud Boys attacking peaceful demonstrators at the George Floyd protests, to the spikes in anti-Asian hate crimes, to the deadly Capitol insurrection in January. Several hate groups have since mass migrated to online social networks, through which they espouse radical conspiracy theories and continue to desensitize, convert, and recruit followers. In light of the increasingly greater accessibility of hate speech, we must ask ourselves, what tools do we have or must we create to combat violent threats to our democracy? And how do we monitor the resurgence of radical domestic extremism while protecting our most marginalized communities from harm? Today, we will be joined by our guests, Mary McCord and Jonathan Greenblatt, who together will bring their wealth of expertise on this issue. Mary McCord is the legal director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center, where she directs constitutional impact litigation addressing criminal justice reform, First Amendment rights, immigration law, among several other fields. She previously served as the Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 17, and Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division from 2014 to 16. Prior to these roles, she was an assistant U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia for nearly 20 years and most notably served as chief of the criminal division, overseeing all criminal prosecutions in the federal district court. She has also written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Just Security, and has appeared on CNN, ABC, NPR, and other news outlets to discuss domestic extremism and unlawful militia activity. Jonathan Greenblatt is the CEO and sixth national director of the Anti-Defamation League. Under his leadership, the Anti-Defamation League expanded its Center on Extremism to neutralize extremist threats from all sides and established the Center on Technology and Society to combat the spread of anti-Semitism through virtual networks. He also launched Never Is Now, ADL's annual summit on the mitigation of violent hate speech, and was recognized as one of the top 50 nonprofit leaders in 2016, 17, 18, and 19 by the Nonprofit Times. Prior to his work with the ADL, he served as special assistant to former President Barack Obama and director of the Office of Social Innovation. This conversation will be moderated by Professor Kathleen Ballou, assistant professor of United States history at the University of Chicago, CNN contributor, and author. Her book, Bringing the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, uses previously classified FBI documents and personal anecdotes to examine the rise of right-wing extremism. She traces modern white supremacy's genesis to the post-Vietnam War era, when white power activists spun a disturbing narrative about warfare, government betrayal, and the diffusion of deadly military technology to American civilians. Her research has been featured on AC360 with Anderson Cooper, ABC's political documentary, Homegrown Hate, The War Among Us, and PBS NewsHour, among other media outlets. Beyond academia, Professor Ballou has contributed op-eds to the New York Times, CNN, and the Washington Post. This coming spring quarter, she will teach a history colloquium course entitled The American Apocalypse, which examines how the everyday American civilian has historically imagined the end of the US Republic and the world at large. Please join me as we now welcome Professor McCord, Mr. Greenblatt, and Professor Ballou. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so delighted to be here with you today and to have the chance to talk with these distinguished panelists. I think I would like to just begin by asking about your reactions to the events on January 6th, when we saw a group of people, including white supremacists and other members of the militant right, storm the US Capitol building. That's an event that many people, I think, expressed shock and surprise about, but people who study these issues have a more complex reaction. So I'd love to hear, just to begin, your thoughts on when you were watching, what you saw, and what the direction it points us towards in the aftermath.
Does it matter which one of us starts?
Sure, Mary, why don't you start?
So, I have, with my organization, ICAP at Georgetown, we've done anti-militia work for the last several years. And so we've been working pretty closely with researchers who have been tracking the extremist movements over the last years, the coalition of conspiracy theorists, unlawful private militias, accelerationist groups who are, trying to start a civil war to create ultimately a white ethno-state. And, we've been tracking through the past year, their, armed opposition, for example, to public health and safety orders by governors such as in Michigan and in Wisconsin and Ohio and Idaho and elsewhere. We've been tracking how they were coming out during racial justice protests to sort of just to defend against violent anarchists, which the former president was calling anyone who was actually a racial justice protester. And we had been worried about them actually interfering with the election. And then of course, the former president drummed up a false narrative about the election even before the election took place, that it would be, susceptible to election fraud, and that if he didn't win, it would mean that the election was rigged. And then this is something he doubled down on after the election, and it was accelerating all the way up to January 6th. So we've been watching this, and we've been getting daily monitoring from various researchers, and we knew the planning that was taking place. And in fact, we were actually providing this to law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level. Now, I did not personally provide it to the US Capitol Police, I just want to make that clear, but we had been providing it to other law enforcement in the Washington, DC area. And I know from my 20 years of working in criminal law and national security in DC that these are the things that are usually shared among all of the law enforcement, right? Mm-hmm. So, we knew that those among the crowd were planning to encircle the Capitol, that they were determined to what they called stop the steal, to prevent the joint session of Congress from actually opening up and counting the electoral votes and certifying Joe Biden as the president. We knew that that was the intent of those who were the most extreme. But even having said all of that, I was just shocked how ill prepared the security was at the Capitol. I could understand potentially the desire after the debacle of this summer with heavy-handed law enforcement tactics. I could understand maybe trying to start out with like a soft policing presence, but you have to be prepared when in the face of the threats that were coming for a hard policing presence if things go as awry as they did. And they were utterly unprepared. And of course, there's going to be studies about this for years to come. And I think 2 points I would make, and then obviously very interested to hear what Jonathan has to say. 2 points I would make. One of the things that was so dangerous about January 6th is you had all these people I just mentioned, accelerationists, hard white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, and unlawful private militias, some who were heavily armed, at the same place as Americans who probably actually had honestly held beliefs that there was fraud in the election and probably came to express First Amendment rights and probably didn't have an intent to violently overrun the Capitol. But you actually had almost a radicalization in the moment, right? Because you had these people so far to the extreme, they breach the gates, they enter violently, and a crowd becomes a mob, and a mob does things that some of them wouldn't otherwise do. No question, some were intent on doing that to begin with, but thousands ended up participating in this, and that's really dangerous when you put all of those people under one tent. And the second thing is, we have to think about why was law enforcement so ill prepared? Was it because this is a group of basically mostly white men marching up the street who call themselves patriots? And was there just a failure to recognize that this group had the capacity and intent to be violent? I mean, I just don't think we could ignore that. I think the response would have been very, very different if that crowd had looked differently. And of course, part of all of this is the fact that it was, stoked and egged on by the former president and his surrogates, including that very morning. And we know that currently people who are being charged with crimes, some of them are saying we were just doing what the president wanted us to do. How much did that play into it? So, as much as I was worried something like this might happen, I was still shocked to see it happen in our capital. And to see what people were actually willing to do, the extremes they were willing to go to, including killing police officers.
Uh-huh. Jonathan?
So let me just say +1 on what Mary said. No, I think it's interesting how much I agree with much of what she shared. So just to step back, ADL is the oldest anti-hate group in the country. We've been, fighting anti-Semitism, bigotry, extremism for over 100 years. And we have a whole team of analysts, at our headquarters and distributed across the country who watch the bad guys. And we watch the bad guys. It used to be that ADL literally put people in German-American social clubs in the 30s to identify Nazi sympathizers. ADL put people under white hoods in the 50s to help break open the KKK. ADL used to do that kind of work. Now we're watching them, again, where they're convening, not in a rural compound in Idaho, but 24/7 online. So we were watching them not only on the public web, like Facebook, where they were, by the way, parading out in the open, or YouTube or Twitter, but in private groups, like password protected, discussion boards, as well as like messaging platforms like Telegram and Signal and WhatsApp, but also in the dark web. And so much like Mary said, we have watched this build and build and build, where extremists over the last few years have felt emboldened because the president has been repeating their rhetoric, co-opting their conspiracy theories, like literally spreading their stereotypes in ways that, like, again, over the years, we've found like pretty somewhere between baffling and just like really almost inexplicable, as if there was someone, but then again, the White House was literally credentialing white supremacist media in the briefing room or to join him on junkets when he would travel to Davos and other places. So the connections were really quite scary. And I will say, again, to build on a point that Mary made, we became particularly alarmed over the course of the summer when we saw this rhetoric really building ahead of the election. And, we literally flexed up our center and like brought in additional analysts so we could watch, because there was so much that was worrisome as we were looking at and anticipating violence around Election Day. And like Mary, the ADL gave over 1,000 tips in 2020 to law enforcement about potential threats, over 1,000 at the federal, state, and local level. And then after the election, which thankfully wasn't violent, we continue to be alarmed because, as Mary said, the discrediting the election had started before, and then it went on overdrive. When I say it went on overdrive, the president would say things and his people would repeat them. And how do we know that? Because we're watching what his people would say. And it is accelerationists, it is white supremacists, it was these armed militias. The other real thread through all this was QAnon. QAnon, which is a relatively new phenomenon, suddenly became like the beating heart of this movement. And again, enabled the kind of radicalization. And I'll build on a point that Mary made in a second. So we then became very concerned because we anticipated what happened in December in Washington, D.C., when the Proud Boys rampaged through the city. Because, Kathleen, they said, we're going to rampage through the city. The one thing that you can give these people credit for is they tend to do what they say they're going to do. And we were watching what they were saying. And again, giving these tips to law enforcement. So I will share with you that ahead of January 6th, ahead of the Stop the Steal rally, we were so alarmed because all the signals were telling us this was going to be huge. Again, across the kind of whole extremist ecosystem, they were saying we're all going to show up and we're going to interfere with the democratic process, which again, as Mary says, what the president literally was telling them to do. So we did something that we often don't do at ADL, I'll say. We actually wrote a blog post on January the 4th, laying out our concerns. Now, we often don't do that because like we follow the bad guys follow us. And I know Mary can relate to this. Like they want the attention. And you probably saw this too in your research, Kathleen. They crave the validation. So, and I can tell you, they all despise the ADL. So when we write about them, it's deeply validating. And they love that. But we were so concerned that law enforcement wasn't doing more. We posted on January the 4th, here's who's coming. Here's what they're saying, like red alert. And so on January the 6th, we were watching it, not just on Facebook group, not on CNN, although we were, and not just Facebook group, we were watching it on Rumble and DLive and Gab and all the platforms that they were using because our people follow them in all these places. The last thing I'll say is as you mentioned in my bio, I mean, I used to work at the White House. I'm very familiar with working inside a secure perimeter. And I'm very, I have had a fair amount of interaction with the principals, spent a lot of time on the Hill. Like, there's something called an NSSE, a National Security Special Event, which is typically, Kathleen, the kind of like, it's a security protocol when you have a large scale event like a presidential inauguration, where all the different models, all the different agencies, like, by the way, the US Secret Service, are activated appropriately. And as Mary said, it was stunning that there was no presence for what I would describe as literally the most predictable terror attack in American history. Like, again, they told us they were going to do this, and then they did it. And so the idea that these police, the Capitol Police, weren't better supported, when again, I know we had literally been in touch with these people the days before. It's still, I think, a bit of a mystery why, even as you have this mob on the mall, and this will be the last thing that I say, I think what's worrisome, Kathleen, what we can talk about today, and what you and Mary and all of us will be looking at for years to come, is I think that January the 6th wasn't the end. And many people ask me, is it over? Because the FBI is cracking down, DOJ is now cracking down. Is it over? Like, I think that wasn't the end. I think it was the end of the beginning. What Mary described was happening in real time is what I would describe as mass radicalization. Because let's acknowledge, while there were hardened white supremacists, hardened, accelerationists, right? Like, if you look at Charlottesville, it was the hardcore folks who showed up. Compare that with Capitol Hill, right? Here you have the hardcore people, but then tens of thousands of ordinary people, many of whom followed them up into the mall and participated in this terror attack, this planned, intentional terror attack. So what I worry about is, look, as we're still sort of sifting through the debris, scores of millions of people still think President Biden didn't win. That is a stunning departure from reality. But I think what's worrisome is we're in this new phase. And how do we, as civil society, how does law enforcement, how do all of us wrestle with this new reality when you have a lot of people with a lot of scary ideas who now believe, and again, the polling shows that they believe it's okay to use violence to stop the democratic process. I mean, that's brave new world, and a scary one at that.
Thank you so much to both of you for those answers. There's so much here that I would like to unpack. And just as a reminder to the students who are listening and other members of our community, we invite you to use the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. We will happily help you to phrase the question, or we may call on you by video if you are comfortable with that. So, be ruminating. We'll talk for about the first 40 minutes of our program, and then we'll do questions. So I want to talk about a couple of things that came out in both of your presentations that strike me as deeply informed by the history of the movement as I've come to know it. And one of them is around language, and I think this is for Mary, and the other one is around monitoring, and this is really for Jonathan, or maybe for both of you. If you'd like to address both, totally fine. But one of the things that I noticed in the last year, as somebody who has been writing about this for a while, is that there was a sudden pushback against even using the word militia. This was new. It happened in the fall, and it was this went from nobody had ever made this particular point to it was all over Twitter. And one of the things that strikes me about that is that a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what a militia is, the place a militia holds in our national history, and also the claims of legitimacy around militia groups, as well as distinctions like what's a militia and what's a gang. So I would love, Mary, if you wouldn't mind kind of laying out that debate for us, and maybe queuing up for people in the audience the piece that you wrote for the New York Times about militias and legal status. And then Jonathan, the question that I had for you is about, as you say, the ADL has been a really important mechanism for what we know about these groups, because the ADL and other groups like the SPLC were doing that work of monitoring for a very long time before law enforcement was doing it at scale. But now we're in a different kind of moment where the FBI and DHS have identified white supremacist extremism as the predominant terror threat to the United States. And a lot of surveillance resources have now come around to focus on this issue. So I'm interested in hearing from you about, I suppose, the monitoring landscape, how resource sharing is working, whether the FBI is taking the information from monitoring groups like ADL and the other watchdogs, and how that interfacing is working in this kind of new moment. And just for people who are coming to this topic fresh, the FBI has, of course, had a long history of infiltration of extremist groups, but the history shows us that it has overwhelmingly devoted resources towards disrupting the left as opposed to towards disrupting the right, and has really under-resourced infiltration and monitoring, particularly of white power groups, until the very recent past. So this is new, that we have this opportunity of focusing our surveillance resources on this problem. And I'd love to hear both of you talk about that.
Great.
Thanks, Kathleen. So you're right. I think that in the last year, as a result of work of that folks like my organization and others calling attention to the danger of private militias, calling attention to the fact that they're not actually lawful, we have seen some of them denying that they're militias, right? They'll say, we are a group of patriots. We are not a militia. We are here to support and defend the Constitution. And to train people to be able to support and defend the Constitution, right? To kind of cloak what they are in some sort of language that sounds more palatable and more mainstream. And they use that to recruit, to propagandize, to monetize, et cetera. But when we're talking about a private organization of people who train in paramilitary tactics, usually arm themselves with semi-automatic assault rifles and other similar large capacity weapons, and deploy in public to engage with the public, portraying this armed use of force and ability to use force and authority over others. That's a militia. They can call themselves whatever they want, but that is usurping the role of our legitimate military that are authorized by law and our legitimate law enforcement who do have authority over others. And so oftentimes, I like to, when I speak, I like to make 3 points just to try to inform and level set people on this, because the militias have done an amazing job over the last few decades at sort of normalizing what they're doing, and to the extent that most people really believe a mythology of the Second Amendment, a mythology that it protects this activity, and nothing could be further from the truth. So first point, militias will often point to the words well-regulated militia in the Second Amendment of the US Constitution, and that term is used in most state constitution as well. And they'll say, we're well regulated. We have a commanding officer. We have a deputy commanding officer. We work through a hierarchy of chain of command when we deploy. We are well regulated. We are what this country was founded on, back when we first left Europe. Well-regulated, if you actually go back in history to even before the founding, well-regulated has always meant regulated by the government. Even when we were just colonies, and the governors of the colonies and the citizenry of the colonies did not want to have standing armies, they said, well, what we'll do instead for defense is we'll have a militia. Militia meant, and still to this day is defined to mean, all able-bodied residents capable between certain ages, and I say residents, it was really men, of course, between certain ages, who could be called forth by the governor in defense of the colony, later the state, and then armed and trained and supervised by the governor. Not call forth yourself when you think that there's something that you want to be opposed to, and certainly not in opposition to the governor. So that concept was then baked into the US Constitution, and the US Constitution gives Congress the authority explicitly to call forth the militia. They have done that through the militia clauses, which are statutes that establish the state national guards, and every state has a national guard that reports to, guess who? The governor. It also authorized states to have other militias, official militias, besides the National Guard that report to, guess who? The governor. And this was then baked into every state's constitution and statutory scheme, so that every state has a National Guard. Most states also have a second militia that reports to the governor. And some states still have this old notion of the unorganized militia, meaning all able-bodied residents between certain ages who can be called forth by the governor, but only by the governor. So there's no authority, point one, no authority under federal or state law for private groups to form as militias. Point two is they will point to the Second Amendment as the Supreme Court has interpreted it to protect an individual right to bear arms for self-defense. And they'll say, well, we're in an open carry state, so that must mean we can all organize together armed for self-defense, community defense. But this has actually been rejected soundly by none other than the Supreme Court. Back in 1886, the Supreme Court upheld against a constitutional challenge a state anti-militia statute that bars bodies of men from associating together as military units or military companies, or parading or drilling in public with firearms. And that statute exists today on the books of 29 states. And in upholding that statute, the Supreme Court said, there's nothing about this statute that infringes on the right to keep and bear arms. And it is without question that states have to be able to prevent this type of paramilitary activity to protect public safety, peace, and good order. You fast forward to 2008, when the Supreme Court decided the case of District of Columbia versus Heller. This is the first time the Supreme Court actually held that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms for self-defense. And Justice Scalia, writing for the majority, pointedly contrasted that with paramilitary organizations, cited the 1886 case of Presser v. Illinois, and said that case stands for the proposition that states must be able to bar private paramilitary organizations, and no one is even questioning that. So we think that's quite solid in Supreme Court precedent that Second Amendment doesn't protect this activity. The third point is, in fact, all 50 states do prohibit it. First, through their state constitutions, as we've discussed, and their provisions that require the only militia to be reporting to the governor. Most of them, almost all of them, have actually an explicit provision that says in all cases, the military shall be strictly subordinate to the civilian power, meaning the governor. 29 states have this criminal statute I mentioned that was upheld back in 1886. 25 states bar paramilitary activity, which is like training, instructing, demonstrating, or practicing in the use of firearms, incendiary devices, or techniques capable of causing bodily injury or death, knowing and intending to use those during or in furtherance of a civil disorder. So, you can't go out and train so that you can deploy during a racial justice protest and say you're there to protect property. That's training in paramilitary techniques to use it during a civil disorder. That's unlawful in 25 states. And another dozen states prohibit falsely assuming the functions of law enforcement. So when these groups come out and they order people around and pretend that they have authority, they're also in violation of law. So, the bottom line is it's high time we sort of correct the record across the country. And a lot of this last year was spent, I don't even like to use the term educating. It sounds almost condescending, just informing about what the Constitution really says, because you will find that even law enforcement sometimes think that the Second Amendment protects it. Now, later, I'm sure we'll talk about there's also a problem that law enforcement sometimes supports militias, but even those who don't support it oftentimes are misinformed. And one thing we learned, to Jonathan's point earlier about who's watching who, we put out fact sheets all over the country before the election explaining that militias are unlawful. We put them one out individualized for all 50 states. We talked about how their activity at the polls could be voter intimidation. And the day before the election, one of the nationwide militia groups that I will not mention by name actually put out its own directive to stand down and not go to the polls, and cited our fact sheets and quoted from our fact sheets and linked to our fact sheets. So yeah, they are watching the people who are watching them, as you indicated, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I want to come back to several things in that in a minute, including the claim to constitutionalism and sort of this broad dispute about who a patriot is within this political moment. But let's first go back to the question of monitoring agencies and surveillance. So Jonathan.
Yeah. So a few thoughts. First of all, I just I want to take Mary's class. She's really so knowledgeable about this. It's such a treat to have the opportunity to hear her expertise. So we've been at the monitoring functioned for a long time, longer, I think, than any other, or certainly longer than any other organization in civil society today. Again, the techniques have changed, the tactics have evolved relative to kind of the threat matrix. And at the same time, I would say the noise has increased a tremendous amount as well. So something that's very different now than before, Kathleen, is that there is so much chatter and so much noise. Kind of shrinking the signal to noise ratio has never been more complex. And again, we're in an environment where, because of social media and the complicity of the companies in not just allowing this, but actually algorithmically encouraging this because of the way that these systems work, and we can talk about that if you like. Again, I think the chatter's never been higher, and that creates an environment where, again, the phenomenon I'll describe as kind of mass radicalization can occur. As again, political leaders, starting with President Trump, to Senator Hawley, if you will, we're normalizing this kind of extremism, a process that's still underway, which is quite frightening. The algorithmic amplification of this creates an entirely new ballgame. I think you are right, and literally there are a few scholars who are more, read up on this than you, Kathleen. But law enforcement's approach on this has been, I think it's kind to say, uneven. So, look, you could go back to the bombing in Oklahoma City by Timothy McVeigh, which should have alerted us to, number one, the presence of, law enforcement and military, and the nexus between those and white supremacist groups specifically, and more generally right-wing extremists. Like, this was obvious in that moment, and it has only persisted and worsened as we all likely know on this Zoom, as the military and law enforcement have reduced their standards to improve recruiting, and people with the kind of tattoos or backgrounds that otherwise might have been excluded suddenly have been allowed into the ranks. I will say we've had very good truck at ADL with FBI leadership for years, since I've been on the job, from Director Mueller to Director McCabe to Director Wray. I mean, they have always been attentive at the political level, but I think it is absolutely true at the practical level. The resources and the attention just hasn't been there. It's been much more focused, I think, in the not so recent past on left-wing organizations, right, which was real. Like what happened in the 60s, the 50s and the 60s in particular, with the FBI trying to disrupt these perceived threats, to more recently Muslim groups or groups of an Islamic orientation who were perceived to be threats, even when that was somewhat specious. Now, I don't want to undermine the threat of jihadism, which is a real thing. AQAP and ISIS and Al-Shabaab trying to recruit Americans of a particular ethnic background or religious affiliation. That was a real threat. But today, overwhelmingly, the evidence shows us that it's these right-wing groups. And again, as I was saying a minute ago, you just have to open up YouTube. You just have to open up Twitter to see this stuff building. It's concerning. The last thing I'll say is, and some of this relates to the nexus between military and law enforcement and these extremist groups. Just to build on something that Kathy sort of alluded to before, I think it is more than safe to say that had these protesters come with like the black flags of ISIS rather than the blue flags of Trump, had they had large Black Lives Matter banners instead of large like QAnon banners, the law enforcement approach would have been entirely different. I think it really laid very bare the sort of, there's a culture, if you will, of negligence, like malign negligence as it relates to these groups, and a culture of like obsessive fear of people of color and people, again, who identify differently from a religious orientation, Muslims specifically. So that Islamophobia and racism might not be present when Director Wray is testifying before Congress. And again, in his conversations with me, he's always been very clear-eyed about the threat. But when you get down below and you get to more local law enforcement, there are real deeply held biases, which I do think somewhat informed the way they approached the threat on that day. And again, it probably has something to do with the fact that we know there were members active in retired duty who were among the ranks of the militants who stormed the Capitol. And again, the last thing I'll just say before I stop being so long-winded, language is very important, right? This wasn't a riot, it was an attack. These weren't protesters, they were militants. This wasn't spontaneous, it was sophisticated and planned. I mean, their intent was to, I think everybody wanted to stop the steal and disrupt democracy, which itself I think is profoundly terrifying. But there were more than a handful of people who went in with the intent to kidnap and kill legislators. Right. How do we know that? Because they said, we are going to kidnap and kill legislators. So it's really a moment in time, Kathleen, where I think law enforcement now, I think, is going to turn and orient itself against this, because it simply can't ignore, the threat is so laid bare, it can't do anything other than that.
Unbelievably, we are almost at the student question portion of our event. So I'm going to skip constitutional claims and come back to that, I hope, or perhaps students can follow up if they're interested. But I have a question that I would like to ask, and it has sort of two different things built into it. And it's specific to Chicago, where I think people are very aware of the troubled history of policing in the United States. We're in the middle of an enormous movement, both on and off campus, about rethinking the resources allocated to police departments, the problems with tracking police violence, and the outsized impact that policing has had on communities of color, both around University of Chicago and in Chicago more broadly. So this leads me to two different questions. One is about exactly this problem of infiltration that Jonathan has just brought up. And maybe this time we'll let him go first, just to switch it up a little. Because of course, one interpretation about what happened on January 6th has to do with the whiteness of the people who stormed the Capitol and sort of the lack of preparedness or lack of seriousness allocated to the threat. The other piece has to do with questions about the degree of infiltration of policing that has happened at the hands of these groups. And we know to be worried about that because we have better information in other countries that have faced similar things. I think about the work of Cynthia Miller-Idris in Germany. And we also have better information in the armed services, although there too we have incomplete counts. But one thing that's come up a lot in Chicago is that police officers who do have a record of wrongdoing very typically simply move down the road to another police department. And since we have no central infrastructure for keeping records, it's very difficult to track. So that makes me wonder how we can track infiltration and white power affiliation if we don't have central record keeping for policing. So that's one set of wondering about. The other question that I have to admit that I feel very unresolved about is the question of whether we need a new instrument in the law for dealing with domestic terrorism that comes from white power groups. And the reason that this is connected, well, so one set of arguments that I think I've heard several times from people within the FBI is that, of course, and I don't mean to undermine somebody else's opinion, but I think it's clear that someone who carries out a bombing with civilian casualties should have the same punishment, whether they are a member of ISIS or whether they are a member of Atomwaffen. Those are both paramilitary groups. They're both ideologically motivated. The function of bombing in both cases is not just about killing or individual animus, but is about an act of political terror that's meant to have political consequences. So I can see that logic. On the other hand, I know as a historian, and I'm perhaps hyper aware as a historian, that every time we have expanded police powers in the United States, that move has been most felt and the violence has been most felt by communities of color. So I'm reticent to advocate simply, for instance, expanding the Patriot Act to include white power groups. So I'm wondering about your take on that set of issues, and perhaps we'll go to Jonathan first this time and then Mary.
Sure. So quick, I'll try to answer quickly. So first, number one on the infiltration issue. Like, we know the infiltration issue is a problem. We've been talking about it for years. I know that many others have as well. As I said before, as recruiting standards dropped, there was less attention to it. I do get nervous to some degree about the idea of a centralized, police database. Some of that makes me a little bit wary, but there clearly needs to be better information sharing between agencies. We know of these stories of you get fired at this precinct, and so then you move, or in this locality, so you move to another locality. And I do think information sharing, Kathleen, is so critical. That's why we run something. We have like the largest database of hate symbols in the world. I mean, you can find it at adl.org. We have, not all of it is public, but a lot of it is. And we do a ton of education for law enforcement. We trained 15,000 officers last year. The FBI recruits in Quantico. We train all of them on extremism and hate. Like, who are the extremists? What are the latest trends? What do you need to know? But I will say that this issue of infiltration, it's not accidental. I mean, the armed militia groups for years have been saying, trying to actively, and groups like the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers, trying to actively recruit ex-military, both because they learn the tactics and techniques from them, and it lifts them up, it legitimizes them in a way. So I think all of that is really deeply problematic and deserves deep attention. Secretary Austin, Director Wray have both talked about doing this finally. They need top down, not only at the federal level, but at the state and local level, to give guidance to eject any of these people. And I would actually go so far just to add to that, like elected office. It is frightening when you have QAnon enthusiasts, who don't believe Sandy happened on the education committee. Like, who thinks that's normal? So I think we need to have a zero tolerance policy on intolerance in public service. I think to the second question you asked, the second question you asked was about, like, do we need a new law? This right now is an issue that many of us in the civil rights community are wrestling with. Mm-hmm. My personal opinion is that we do not need a new law. And in fact, though, we do need although we don't need a new law, we definitely need new approaches. And I think we can't just rely on government to do it, because like Patriot Act 2, Kathleen, is not the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. There is no pixie dust we can wave. What we really need is a whole of society strategy, government and business and civil society working together. We have an approach that we've developed at ADL. We call it the PROTECT plan. From my years in the government, PROTECT is an acronym. I'm not going to spell it out, but I'll put it in the chat for people who want to see it. But I think, again, we need a whole of society strategy. And we need, again, not necessarily a new, magic bullet law, but we do need innovative new approaches if we're really going to deal with this threat.
Thank you. Mary?
Yeah, associate myself really with almost everything that Jonathan said as usual. I will try to just amplify and add to it with a few other details. One of the challenges with respect to policing and eradicating white supremacism from policing is, as has been indicated, it's at the state and local level. It's very decentralized, and that's part of our federalist scheme, right? Our Constitution, our country was built on this idea that the police power would mostly be reserved to the states, which is why federal laws have to have specific jurisdiction and have to involve things that are interstate and not just intrastate. And we by our constitutional scheme, designate the states as the ones who can mostly take care of the policing power. So the problem is, how do you incentivize at the local level, particularly if you do have elected sheriffs, for example, and elected police who are coming from the very populations that are, hard right to the point of even espousing extremist or nationalist views. And so some of the things that I've been chatting with folks on Capitol Hill about when they'll ask, what can be done is, almost every police force, maybe every police force in the country relies on government grants and government funding. And, so there are levers there that can be pulled about needing to take certain amounts of, certain measures to eradicate their police forces of white supremacist extremism. It can be tied to funding. So there are creative approaches that can be used because of this problem we have with it being so decentralized. I do think it's worth thinking about. I agree, there's some concerns with the centralized base, but you shouldn't be able to just go from one place to the next when you've got a history, not only of like white supremacist extremism, but even just a history of, and maybe these are the same thing, but we certainly know, police brutality in various police forces, whether it's motivated by really hard, white supremacist views or something more subtle cultural bias, those people saying they go from one police department to another. And so there's a lot to be done there. When it comes to new authorities, I mean, we could spend the entire hour talking about this. It's very complex and much more complex than people like to make it seem. I would just make, I guess, 3 points. we don't designate domestic organizations as terrorist organizations the way we do foreign organizations like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, et cetera. And that's for good reason. That's because our First Amendment protects, people in the US, they protect them, their freedom of expression, even to express views that most of us would find abhorrent or hateful or just awful. And so the reason we can designate foreign terrorist organizations is foreign organizations don't have First Amendment rights. And so the designation scheme is based on it being foreign, it being an organization that engages in acts of terrorism or has the capability and intent to engage in acts of terrorism, and is a threat to US nationals or US national security. So, sometimes we talk about, well, why don't we designate Proud Boys, right? Canada just did. Part of it is that organization, they might do things that are not protected by the First Amendment, such as engage in acts of violence, threats, incitement to imminent violence. None of that's protected by the First Amendment, but they also might engage in their, white male chauvinist, rhetoric that is protected. So it's very tricky to think about that and to think about a way to do that constitutionally. And so most people do not advocate for that, even though they get, asked about it. It also could be totally misused. You remember the president this summer, without any basis in law, saying, we're going to designate Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. There is no authority for such designations. Second, on just a domestic terrorism statute, this is of huge concerns to the civil rights and civil liberties community, of which I consider myself a part, because of the abuses that you've indicated, that Jonathan's indicated historically. We have seen historically abuses. So there are gaps in our terrorism statutes. There are particularly gaps when it comes to using a firearm or a car ramming. If you're not doing that, even if you're doing it to intimidate or coerce, if you're not doing it for ISIS or some foreign terrorist organization, and you're not directing it at a US government official, like an assassination, then there's no terrorism a crime that applies to that. And there are gaps that would take me far too long to get into about what impact does this really have beyond, of course, the obvious one, like this lack of moral equivalence. The El Paso shooter, if he had pledged bayat to Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, right before his shooting, he would be charged with a boatload of terrorism crimes. Instead, he's not. Sometimes hate crimes can fill that gap, but sometimes they can't, because hate crimes have special authorities. So it's something to consider, but even in any consideration would have to be built in enormous transparency and accountability to ensure against misuse, right? Real reporting, transparent reporting of how the FBI is using resources. And the third point I would make is I do think it is worth considering at the federal level a federal anti-militia statute, because even though I indicated every state has this, there's, again, go back to point one, state law is enforced by state and local officials. So we are talking about elected district attorneys, the prosecutors, elected police chiefs and sheriffs who have little incentive and great disincentive if their community is a community that is, filled with people that have pretty extreme views and supports militias, which we see in some rural communities in this country. And they are not going to be the ones who decide they're going to force these laws. And unfortunately, in many states, the state attorney general, who might be, and I can tell you, Michigan state attorney general would really like to be going after some of the unlawful militias in her state, but it's harder when you don't have the cooperation. And some state attorneys general don't actually have the authority to enforce general criminal law in their state. It's reserved to those local prosecutors. So when you're not going to have the political will to do anything about groups that take up arms, sometimes in opposition to the government, like we saw on January 6th, like we saw in the storming of the state houses this past spring, take up arms supposedly to protect and defend property and shoot and kill people like we saw in Kenosha, if the states and locals aren't going to do anything about it, maybe that is a place where the federal government should be looking at legislation, because again, these are not just state and local problems. These militias, we've seen, they travel widely, and they bring their guns and they wreak havoc. So that is an area I think is worth further discovery.
Thank you so much. I mean, that also draws our attention to the ways that our voting system works to elect governors who are friendly to that, right? I mean, it rests on other kinds of white supremacy that are built into our laws and governance and gerrymandering problems and all of this other set of things.
Can I say something about that, Kathleen? That's the biggest.
And then we have to get to the students.
The biggest thing is, turns out, not just the laws, but the norms.
Yeah.
The norms, you elect people who want to tear down the democratic system. Like, we have to figure out, how do we wrestle with that? Because the system today doesn't allow us to do so very effectively.
I think that's absolutely right. Okay, so I'm going to call on Alina Kim, who's a student at University of Chicago.
Hi again, I'm Alina, third year at the college. I just have a question about the characteristics of a type of form we saw of extremism at the Capitol insurrection. I recently watched an interview with the QAnon shaman Jake Angeli while he was in prison, and he stated that he prayed to God in the sacred Senate space. He was a peaceful singing shaman, and he prevented people from stealing objects from the Capitol.
Yeah.
How do you see this new form of extremism, which spouts quote unquote peace, developing in the future?
I'll take that real quick. Like, if you don't mind, Mary, I'll take it. So these people constantly try to, Mary kind of alluded to this, they call themselves patriots rather than militants. They say they're kind of just, ad hoc groups rather than organized militias. Alina, it is their intention to warp and weaponize language to rationalize their sort of irrationality. So they're going to talk about peace, talk about patriotism, they're going to talk about America first, right? But the notion of America as a pluralistic and democratic state is what they actually care the least about. It's actually America last. So we've got to be careful to cut through the clutter and hear what they're actually saying and see them for what they are: dangerous militants who don't hold dear, any of the kind of conventional norms and values that have held this country together for 240 some odd years.
Or put more simply, perhaps also, I mean, the nation that they are interested in protecting is not the United States, but the white polity. And I think one of the interesting parts of your question is about a host of things related to media representation and how 60 Minutes makes a decision to give the QAnon shaman a microphone like that without giving the context of the very violent ends that he espouses. And another question has to do with QAnon itself, which I think is very little understood compared to a lot of the rest of what we've been talking about. It works so quickly, it's so new. But Mary, do you want to add to that at all?
I have plenty I could say, but I want to make sure we get some more questions, and the responses are great so far. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Alina. The next question is from Lee Breslau. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who's also, I think, you Chicago student. Do we have you here, Lee? Maybe I will summarize that. Oh, no, there you are.
I'm embarrassed to say I'm not a student. I am actually the university architect at the University of Chicago. And this, I'm really delighted and fascinated by this presentation, and hope actually we could have many more on this topic. My question is, history offers terrifying examples of far-right movements taking on political power and national leadership. Other than war as the corrective response to that kind of usurpation, are there other models of opposition that have proven effective in preventing extremist movements from succeeding?
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question, right? We could go many different directions with it. I do think, one thing that's unique about this more recent moment has been, and maybe it's not so unique, because if you go back to the founding of this country, I mean, we've only recently started to call what happened with racial lynchings terrorism, but that's what it was, right? So we've had terrorism baked into our country's history since its earliest days, and approved in many ways by the state, right? And that's what allowed that to take place for as long as it did. That's why even after we had a civil war, as things seemed to be trending to war, more equal opportunity, then we had Jim Crow laws come in to squash that. We've been through this cycle many times. What I was going to say originally is, what's unique about this moment, before I realized it's not unique about this moment, is in this recent past, we had the president himself being such a central part of making the extremism seem acceptable. You had a person with a veneer of credibility in a position of power and privilege who was, giving validity to the movement. But as I think back on history, that has also happened historically as governmental leaders allowed the types of racial inequity that our country was frankly founded on. And so, I can never condone any type of violence as a means toward an end, but I think that what Jonathan said a few minutes ago is spot on. Like, this is a whole of society effort. This isn't a government. I mean, the government's got to be part, and the government certainly can't be the problem, but we have to change institutionally so much. There is a reason why people are drawn to extremism, whether it was Islamist extremism, because like I've seen this movie before, right? People who were drawn to go travel to join ISIS by disinformation, by propaganda, by radicalizing online, and by feeling that they wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves, part of a movement. And that is now happening, and has happened historically, but is now happening domestically when it comes to these new conspiracy theories and these new far-right extremism that has a little bit of a different flavor than some of our historical ones, although Kathleen would know that better than I, because of this attempt to make it appeal to more of the mainstream. And so what is the heart of that? These people have grievances. Is it economic? Is it fear of being a majority minority country and they will lose their positions of power and influence? And I think that has to be a lot of it. So that means our institutions, our biggest companies, our social media platforms, our influencers, whether it's in sports, music, whatever, like this has got to be across government to sort of not only dismantle sort of the systemic racism that our institutions are built on, financial, education, housing, et cetera, but also espouse the idea that everyone having opportunity is good for everyone. So it's not zero sum. The white people in rural Idaho are not going to lose if we make the world a better place for people of color in the rest of the country. Like, we all can gain from that. That is a big bit of business to do, Lee. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but I don't think there's any other way to be successful if you can't get that kind of coalition way more broadly than just civil rights groups or activists or even government.
Thank you so much. We're going to go to one more question while we have time here. So the next question is Sophie Hare.
Hello, thank you for coming and talking to us today. So I have a question about anti-Semitism and its global rise. So I know that there have been spikes in France, Germany, the US, Canada, and Britain in particular. And so I was just wondering how do we attribute this global acceleration? I know that Mr. Greenblatt has noted that the US spike has been aligned with President Trump's rise to power, but do we attribute it to a growing populist movement? How can we explain it?
It's a great question. I appreciate you asking it, Sophie. So I think there are probably a few things going on. I will acknowledge that I think in every country there can be different dynamics that are local, and there are different historical antecedents, right? So what's happening in Germany and France, again, very different than what's happened here, but there are a few things. So number one, I do believe that the rise of populism and the extremism that often comes with it is fueling this. And so what you have is an environment where systems are failing, like the government doesn't seem to be able to get anything done. Business isn't creating the jobs that people expected. They're saddled with debt or other things, and they look to blame in that environment when systems fail, like scapegoat. People are vulnerable, susceptible to scapegoating, often by populist leaders who oversimplify the problems and offer kind of false answers. And scapegoats are figure large in those kind of situations. And so indeed, the Jews are a convenient scapegoat. You actually see it. Sometimes it's the Jewish people, sometimes it's the Jewish state, but it ends up with swastikas on a synagogue, or people being assaulted while they walk to work, or students on campus being afraid to be openly affiliated with like Hillel. Like, there are dynamics here which are very similar. So I think we should also acknowledge we're talking about right-wing extremism today because it is far and away the most violent and dangerous threat to this country. There's just no question about that. All the data supports that, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, like, we also need to acknowledge that no part of the political spectrum or the ideological spectrum is exempt from intolerance or extremism. So like in the UK, you have a kind of like, I'll call it a left-wing extremism that's pushed out a lot of the anti-Semitism, that's ended up intimidating and marginalizing, again, Jewish students on campus environments, Jews in politics, like the Labour Party, and so on and so forth. In France and Germany, while there are far-right movements, particularly in Germany, that are profoundly terrifying, and the politicization of them, Sophie, like through the Deutschland, the AfD party and whatnot, is scary. And yet there is also a real issue with radicalized people who coming back from Syria and Iraq, or even local people of North African descent who espouse like a jihadism that's more typically found in civil war Syria, who then, we've seen that murdering Jews, not just in France, although that's happened on several occasions in Toulouse, in Paris, in Marseille, in Nice, but also in places like the Netherlands or Belgium. And I could give you lots of examples of this, but from the Hypercacher supermarket to many others, have been really frightening murders of Jewish people at the hands of so-called Al-Qaeda supporters, or people who radicalized with this militant notion we might call Islamism. So anyways, from right-wing extremism to kind of a left-wing extremism to kind of a radical Islamism, and it comes from people who don't have the answers and maybe ignorant to begin with, and then are susceptible to scapegoating and whatnot. The second thing I would just say is social media. So again, what we now see, we had European white supremacists in Charlottesville. We've had American white supremacists training over there. We've had people like Jeremy Corbyn feted over here. We know AQAP and ISIS have used social media very effectively. That has become kind of like a global superhighway to spread hate and ignorance, which also I think has a lot to do with the rise of anti-Semitism around the world.
I think that's right. And I'm very sorry we are at time. So I need to now extend my sincere thanks to Mary McCord and Jonathan Greenblatt. It's such an honor to speak with both of you. And I know that we as a small group and also we as a society have quite a lot of work ahead. So I thank you too to the audience for joining us. It's a difficult topic, but an urgent one. And I appreciate you taking the time to give some thought to it today and in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.